Hello and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential election. Today's lecture covers elections from 1840 to 1856. This is during the second party system of the United States when the Whigs and the Democrats were vying for power at both the presidential and congressional and local levels. So in the previous lecture, I had discussed the victory of Martin Van Buren, sitting vice president and one of the co-founders of the Democratic Party, along with Andrew Jackson, in the election of 1836. A relatively tight election in which Van Buren won over 4 different Whig candidates. As I had mentioned in that previous lecture, Van Buren was sometimes called a little magician for his success in crafting a strong political party for the Democratic Party in the state of New York. And as I also mentioned, he was crucial to the formation of the Democratic Party at a national level with Andrew Jackson. But in his presidency, whatever magic he had failed. First was the Panic of 1837, the most significant economic crisis that the U.S. had faced up to that time, a depression essentially. His opposition to federal infrastructural projects also cost him a lot of influence, especially in the West. And his opposition to the expansion of slavery to the new territories lost him a lot of support among the Southern Democrats who were suspicious of him, and we'll see later for pretty good reasons. He was certainly not an abolitionist. There were very few abolitionists at the time, but he was suspicious about the expansion of the United States and especially about expansion of the institution of slavery. As a result, he opposed the admission of Texas to the Union. Texas had just successfully rebelled against Mexico. U.S. settlers had established a Republic of Texas and wanted admission to the Union, but he was not keen on that. So the Panic of 1837 was essentially a significant depression. Here's an illustration showing the difficulties. As far as the causes, as was true for other economic panics during this period, like the one of 1819, speculative land investments in the new lands along the frontier was a big issue. There was a sort of a big boom in land, and the market would often get a little bit out of control. Andrew Jackson had also issued a directive stating that payment for government land, and these lands were sold. It wasn't until the Civil War when the Homestead Act was approved by the Republican Congress when land was, to a certain level, was given freely to homesteaders. So this time it had to be purchased. But Andrew Jackson was very suspicious of paper money. And he decreed that it had to be paid in gold or silver, which caused some problems, to say the least. There were also global issues. There was a drop in cotton price at this time that affected the United Kingdom, which was the main manufacturer of cotton textiles, and it also affected southern states of the United States. The Bank of England tightens credit. That reduces investments in the United States because U.S. Relied fairly heavily on British investments at the time. And the government didn't do much. The Democrats, Martin Van Buren and the Democrats in Congress, believed in laissez-faire policies. In other words, let the market take care of itself. This later becomes a feature of the Republican Party. But the Republican Party, when it adopted laissez-faire policies, didn't want the government to be regulating industry. The Democrats at the time were concerned that the government would be coddling industries, or maybe I should just say powerful economic forces. So they wanted the government not to do that in the interest of the common people. At least that was certainly how they portrayed it. So anyway, the Whigs see their big chance in the next election, 1840. And a very interesting political operative from New York named Thurlow Weed helps orchestrate a new electoral strategy, borrowing from a lot of ideas that had already been pioneered by the Democrats. But Weed was an influential New York newspaper publisher and Whig strategist. He had been a leader of the anti-Masonic Party. He's going to go on to be very influential in the creation of the Republican Party. But what his campaign that he helped organize in 1840 for the Whigs was to have a much greater use of political media. He also created a faux or false populist campaign. I'll outline that in a few minutes. And he also helped develop negative campaigning. Well, this was nothing new, but he really focused on the economics involved. So he referred to Martin Van Buren as Martin Van Ruin in regard to the Panic of 1837 and his lack of actions that Thurlow Weed thought could have been used to restore economic prosperity. So the selected candidate is William Henry Harrison. He ran in the previous election as one of 4 Whigs and did very well in Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, and a few other states. Thurlow Weed and others helped craft this image of William Henry Harrison that was really quite at odds with the reality. So first I'll talk about the reality, then I'll turn to the image. The reality was that he came from a very prominent Virginia plantation-owning family, an elite family by any definition. His father signed the Declaration of Independence and served as governor of Virginia. William Henry Harrison himself was classically educated, as was common in that class at that time, so an excellent education, but decided to pursue a military career, and he gained fame fighting the indigenous peoples of the Old Northwest. By age 28, he was governor of Indiana Territory. It wasn't a state at that time. Definitely came from a position of wealth and privilege. The campaign, however, was that he was, like Andrew Jackson, a man of the people. That he was born in a log cabin, and he drank hard cider. Now, in the large farm that he owned in Ohio, there was a log cabin. Certainly he was not a dweller in log cabins, far from it. Hard cider was an interesting cultural valence, if you will. So at this time, hard cider was the drink of the common people, especially along the frontier. Apples were easily grown. John Chapman, or Johnny Appleseed, gained fame for moving beyond the settlement frontier and establishing apple orchards and apple nurseries, partly in terms of land speculation, but he was very, very much devoted to the cause. And apples were most important for alcohol. They were not particularly high quality. Certainly people would eat them, but the vast majority of the apple crop would go into hard cider, very easy to press and ferment. At this time, the elite, especially in the East, drank a certain amount of imported wine, and hard liquor was very important as well, but hard cider was sort of considered the drink of the people. And William Henry Harrison's campaign really focused on cider and log cabins. They were in almost all of the posters and publicity. And it's interesting, this involved actually turning mockery on its head. So a prominent Democratic newspaper, the Baltimore Republican, had ran an article or an editorial about William Henry Harrison. The actual wording is a little bit in contention, but the gist of it isn't. And the line was something like, give him a barrel of hard cider, a pension of $2,000 a year, and he will sit the remainder of his days in a log cabin and read moral philosophy. So sit in a log cabin, this was really sort of Eastern mockery of the Westerner, because that was the West at the time, when a lot of people lived in log cabins, not William Henry Harrison. And reading moral philosophy, that goes back to his classical education. Essentially, this is in reference to the common sense realism school of the Scottish Enlightenment, which I talked about in a previous lecture. But the campaign literature, on the whole campaigning process, it involved a lot of rallies, picnics, sort of celebrations, especially at Election Day. As I mentioned before, at this time, ballots were not printed by the government, they were printed by the parties. So election day at polling places was quite a scene, as party operatives would be handing out ballots for their electors and other people running for their party and competing with each other. A lot of alcohol was served, a lot of, especially for the Whigs, a lot of hard cider. So it's really campaigns become mass spectacle and popular entertainment. And this has been initiated by the Jacksonians, but many would say perfected by the Whigs. There was consternation among the Democrats that the Whigs have beat us at our own game. Sorry, and the cartoon below is also quite illustrative because it's making a couple of points. One, it's making the point that the Whigs are the party of the future. They're the party of the nascent transportation revolution with railroads and locomotives, which railroad boom is really getting going at this time. So that's the wave of the future. So we see William Henry Harrison on a steam locomotive with the engine being a barrel of hard cider pulling a log cabin. And then you see Martin Van Buren in Uncle Sam's cab pulled by a horse and then hitting an embankment labeled Clay, which would be Henry Clay, the other most prominent Whig politician of Kentucky. So it's the people's line, take care of the locomotive. Music was also very important in this campaign. And the theme song of the William Henry Harrison campaign was Tip-and-Tie or Tippecanoe and Tyler Too. If you go to the Wikipedia article on the presidential campaign of 1840, you can click a button and you can hear a modern rendition of this song, and I'd really recommend people do it because it's really quite something to listen to. But as some of the lyrics go here, what's the cause of this commotion? Motion our country through. It's a ball a rolling on for Tippecanoe and Tyler Too. So Tippecanoe was a term for William Henry Harrison. I'll explain that with the next slide. John Tyler being his vice presidential candidate. And anyway, with them we will beat Little Van. Again, mockery for his short stature. Van is a used up man. So again, I'd recommend actually listening to a modern rendition of this song. Tippecanoe comes from the Battle of Tippecanoe. William Henry Harrison, like I said, after his classical education, becomes a military man, goes to the Old Northwest, and fights against the indigenous Confederacy of Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a Shawnee leader, and along with his brother had cobbled together an alliance of most of the nations or tribal groups of the Old Northwest. Quite a challenge to the United States. This was right before the War of 1812, and was one of the reasons for the War of 1812 because there were a lot of allegations that the British were helping Tecumseh. But Tecumseh was defeated decisively at the Battle of Tippecanoe. He went on to fight a few more battles, but it was pretty much the end of things, and so that brought William Henry Harrison to a prominent position. So Harrison has a decisive win against Martin Van Buren in the election of 1840. And the Whigs take the House by a pretty substantial margin, 132 to 98, and take the Senate also, 27 to 22. And you can see on the map that Van Buren lost his own home state of New York, only won New Hampshire in the Northeast, won a couple of southern states that were particularly ill-disposed towards the Whigs, Virginia, South Carolina, got Alabama, and he did pretty well in the far west. But in the Northeast and much of the West, you could see Harrison was the victor. And if we look at the geographical patterns, it's similar to what we've seen before, so I'm not going to analyze it in much detail. You can see how New Hampshire had really... and much of Maine had gone to the Democratic Party by this time. And the Democrats very strong in northern Pennsylvania, which was a relatively rugged area, not highly commercial by any means. And Van Buren also did very well in the far west. The more frontier areas did well in the northern parts of Alabama and Georgia, into parts of Mississippi, which are dominated by smallholder farms rather than big plantations. The Whigs did very well on the plantation belt, did extremely well in southern Louisiana with its big sugar plantations that were not competitive, so they wanted with the Caribbean, so they wanted tariffs. You could see Harrison did very well in Kentucky, many parts of North Carolina as well. These are areas that wanted the internal improvements that the Whigs promised. So the Whigs had this big victory, but their joy was short-lived. William Henry Harrison died after a month in office. The conventional story is that he gave the longest inaugural speech that had been given to that point. It was a cold and raw day in March, which was when the inauguration happened in those days. Got sick, it got worse, and he died soon thereafter. So Tippecanoe is gone, and Tyler too. Well, John Tyler was not even really a Whig. He was a former Jacksonian Democrat, and like others, turned against Jackson over nullification. In other words, he wanted more states' rights, more state autonomy, which is the opposite of the Whig platform. So he was brought in not so much for his political beliefs, but rather to appeal to a certain group of anti-Jacksonians. He's in office and he vetoes pretty much everything the Whigs are trying to push through. They want to create a new national bank. He vetoes it. They want to raise the tariff. He vetoes it. They want more internal improvements that he vetoes. Most of his cabinet resigns, and he is dubbed by newspapers his accidency. Nobody really wanted him. Democrats didn't support him. Whigs didn't support him, and so he's not going to be renominated. But the Whigs suffer a massive loss in the House in the next election, 1842. They go from 142 to 72 seats. You can see on the map the Democrats have gained all of Connecticut, a state that used to be a very strong Federalist state, and then a strong state for the National Republicans, and then the Whigs. In New York, really, they only have the far west. You could see a lot of gains in the Old Northwest and the South and other places. In the next presidential election year, 1844, the big issue is whether to annex Texas. As I had mentioned before, Martin Van Buren had not been in favor. Most Democrats were, and many Whigs were as well. Especially Southern Whigs very much wanted to annex Texas, which would be another slave state. Southern Whigs were it was the plantation class in the South, the plantation owning class in the South that really supported the Whigs, and the more trade-oriented areas of the South as well. So they really wanted this annexation of Texas to the United States. And the push for annexation was part and parcel of a larger set of beliefs that are generally called manifest destiny. This was the view that the United States was heavily based on American exceptionalism. The United States was a unique country, and the more extreme versions, a country favored by God. So there was divine justification for expansion all the way to the Pacific. This was connected with a belief in an American moral exceptionalism, as well as just a desire for more land and resources. The Whigs in 1844 nominate Henry Clay again, third time he had run, but he was skeptical about annexing Texas. So again, he's a Southerner, but he's from the far north of the South, from Kentucky, and the desire for expansionism was not nearly as strong as it was in the more southern belt of where larger plantations, in particular cotton plantations. There were no cotton plantations, or very few anyway, in Kentucky. This one thing it shows is how Henry Clay had changed. In 1812, he was one of the main war hawks who wanted war with the United Kingdom and got it, but he was not keen at this point in his life with war with Mexico. He thought that would be a dangerous gambit, expensive and deadly. He also wanted to preserve what political scientists or people at the time called the sectional balance. They would call the regional balance between free and slave states. And he was afraid Texas would sort of undermine that compromise. And he thought that expansion should be gradual and peaceful. And one of his more famous lines is, I would rather be right than president. So he knew this wasn't a particularly popular stance. A lot of people wanted annexation, but he wanted to stay true to his principles. The Democrats nominate a dark horse candidate, James K. Polk. He was from Tennessee and was a protege of Andrew Jackson. He was sometimes called the Young Hickory. But Polk was a very strong supporter of expansionism, a very strong believer in manifest destiny. And he wanted a lot. He wanted not just Texas, but he wanted California. This is right before the gold rush. Just a portrait of Polk from 1849. That was the main year of the gold rush to California. He wanted the Oregon Territory, which was shared with the United Kingdom at the time. Was not worried about war with Mexico. He was eager for war with Mexico, really. He was endorsed by President Tyler, nominally a Whig, who was not running again. As I said, nobody wanted him. It's actually a fairly narrow election. Well, quite a narrow election. You could see Polk won the Electoral College fairly easily, but the popular vote was essentially split. Polk did very well in the far west and in the south. The south is the far south, I should say, from South Carolina through Louisiana, as the main zone of cotton plantations, and there's a real desire for expansion into Texas, and including Texas in the United States. So no surprise, after Polk's victory, Texas is annexed. War with Mexico follows, which, like I say, Polk was eager for. The war was the United States certainly won the war and took a huge amount of territory from Mexico, but it wasn't particularly easy. It was a somewhat difficult war. Interestingly, three important generals that war were later to be nominated for president: John C. Fremont and Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. Zachary Taylor becomes president. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But more important was, after the United States did finally defeat Mexico, and it took an invasion of Mexico City by Scott really to do it, Mexico cedes a vast amount of territory. So the U.S. gets Texas, but you can see that red area of the Texas Republic, its boundary with Mexico was still contested. Texas claimed all the way to the Rio Grande, and the United States got that territory. Texas waived some of its larger claims in the Northwest, but all that green territory is ceded by Mexico to the United States. It's not the current boundary, because there's something called the Gadsden Purchase that happens a little bit later under the presidency of Millard Fillmore. But the U.S. gains all of California, what is today Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, New Mexico, much of Colorado, even part of Wyoming. So it's a huge territorial gain. Ardent American expansionists, real believers in manifest destiny, and they wanted more, especially Southerners. So you could see there were demands of not just the territories that the United States got, but many thought the United States should have taken much more of Mexico, including the Yucatan Peninsula, and even more important, Cuba. So Cuba was still controlled by Spain. Spain had lost its Latin American empire on the mainland of South America and Middle America by the early 1820s, but still held on to some islands. And Cuba was a very rich, fertile soil, major plantation zone, and the southern plantation owning class, they wanted the continued expansion of plantation agriculture. They wanted to move into the newly acquired territories in the Southwest, but they also knew most of those areas were by no means climatically suited for plantation agriculture, but they knew that Cuba was quite close to Florida, and they desperately wanted it. Polk offered Cuba $100 million to Spain. Spain refused. A decade or so later, the United States the Democrats in the United States are going to push this even harder. So Polk was also interested in the Oregon Country, so-called Oregon Country, which at the time included most of what is now the province of British Columbia and the U.S. states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and a chunk of Montana as well. So there was a lot of fur trapping and trading in this area, mostly controlled by indigenous nations, but there were a number of forts and trading posts that both that the Americans established and that the British established as well. So after 1818, when the boundary between the U.S. and Canada, then under British control, was negotiated by John Quincy Adams and the Monroe administration, they set the boundary at the 49th parallel in the Great Plains region, but then the area further to the west is under this sort of joint administration. Ardent American expansionists wanted it all. There was actually a slogan, 5440 or fight, 5440 being, as you can see on the map on the left, that's 54 degrees north latitude, 40 minutes, 54 degrees, 40 minutes north latitude. And that's back basically down to the far southern extension of Alaska, then under Russian control. The extreme British claim would be the 42nd degrees latitude. That's the current border between California and Oregon. So this was an issue, and it was intensifying because American settlers were streaming into the fertile Willamette Valley of Oregon. That starts in the late 1830s. It really intensifies in the early 1840s. So the Oregon Trail, which you can see on this map, had been established in between, say, what is now western Nebraska and the Willamette Valley. There are fertile pockets that can be irrigated, but it's mostly semi-arid or arid, not very conducive for agriculture, whereas the Willamette Valley, very fertile soils, abundant water, and it attracted a lot of migrants who are pouring in, and they're American and they want to be part of the United States. And anyway, while at war with Mexico, Polk wanted to add territory, but he didn't want undue confrontation with the United Kingdom. He certainly did not want to go to war with the United Kingdom, and the slogan 5440 or fight. The United States is involved with the War of Mexico. So a treaty is hammered out between the United States and Britain, 1846, and the Oregon Territory is divided, with Britain, later Canada, getting the north, essentially on the 49th degree parallel, although on Vancouver Island extends further south than that, and that goes to the United Kingdom, hence Canada as well. The United Kingdom really wanted to go all the way down to the Columbia River, which would have included what is now Western Washington, but a compromise was made and the areas were split. Like I said, this is a good deal for the United States. If you look at the population today, British Columbia has about 5.6 million, but if you add Oregon, Washington, and Idaho together, it's about 3 times the population. And just looking at this map showing territorial expansion under different presidents, Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson is huge, as I mentioned in a previous lecture. Under Monroe, although negotiated by John Quincy Adams, the U.S. got Florida, which at that time included the Gulf Coast of Alabama and Mississippi, got the Red River Valley of the North in what is now Minnesota and North Dakota, down a little bit into South Dakota, very fertile area. But then under Polk, you can see an even larger gain from Texas and all of the Southwest and all of the Northwest as well. So that is a vast territorial gain. Also, new states were admitted right before Polk came into office. Florida came in as a slave state, and he maintained the policy of trying to balance free and slave states. So Texas comes in, and Florida, that's 2 more slave states, but 2 more free states, Iowa and Wisconsin, are added as well. The acquisition of all this new territory reignites the slavery controversy, and in a big way. So, if you remember from previous lecture, if you watched it, in 1820, the Missouri Compromise had been worked out, where Missouri came into the Union as a slave state, but at the same time, areas further to the west, slavery would be prohibited north of 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. Slavery would be prohibited north of that line if any new territories come into the Union. And if we extend that all the way across the border, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, you can see the Missouri Compromise would have allowed slavery in Arizona, most of Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California, and not with the rest. The abolition movement is growing in the North. It's especially focused on the not allowing slave power to extend any further west. And the House actually passed what was known as the Wilmot Proviso, which would have prohibited slavery in any of that area ceded by Mexico to the United States. It was filibustered in the Senate and failed, so it becomes a big contentious issue. The southern slave states really want slavery to extend into that area. Northerners don't want it. 1848, let's jump up to the next election. Polk had decided not to run again. He was quite popular and probably would have done very well, but it was not his desire. So the Democrats nominate Lewis Cass of Michigan, and Cass is a proponent of what is called popular sovereignty. This was actually devised by Stephen Douglas, Democratic senator from Illinois, very powerful senator, and the opponent of Abraham Lincoln. I'll talk later on about the Lincoln-Douglas debates, very famous debates. Lincoln did not want slavery to extend and further west, and what Stephen Douglas and Lewis Cass said was, well, let the settlers in those areas decide if they want slavery or not. It's up to them. And again, this goes back to the very fundamental idea of the Democratic Party that states, and even before they become states, when they're territories, the people who live there ought to have a lot of autonomy and say on issues like that. The Whigs nominate Zachary Taylor, one of the generals from the Mexican War. He's popular as a general, old Rough and Ready, as his troops called him. A relatively effective general, perhaps not the most effective. But anyway, it wasn't even clear that he was a Whig at this time. And this is an interesting phenomenon that's going to be repeated, especially in the 1950s, when Dwight Eisenhower, commander of the Allied forces in Europe, was extraordinarily popular, and the Democrats wanted to nominate him, at least talked about it. Nobody knew what his politics were. Ultimately, it's revealed that he's a Republican, and the Republicans nominated him, and he wins 2 terms as president. But his quite a moderate Republican, but his political views weren't even well known. So Zachary Taylor's a Southerner. He's from Louisiana, has a big plantation. So he sort of represented the Southern Whigs, or the Cotton Whigs, as they were sometimes called. And the Northern Whigs, the Conscience Whigs, are becoming increasingly opposed to slavery, or at least opposed to its expansion into the West. So the division in the Whig Party is accelerating. And then Martin Van Buren, fascinating, one of the main architects of the Democratic Party, along with Andrew Jackson. It created the Albany Regency in New York with a really effective party mechanism, really the first in the United States. He bolts his party that he had helped create and runs under the mantle of a relatively new party called the Free Soil Party, which opposes the expansion of slavery. So Martin Van Buren, as a Democrat, had of course worked hand in glove with Southern Democrats who were in favor of slavery and its expansion. But he's getting on in years now, and he's sort of rethinking some of his positions. He hated Lewis Cass, evidently, hated the idea of popular sovereignty, did not want slavery to expand. So he bolts a party that he helped created and joined this new one. He knew he wasn't going to win, but he was hoping that Lewis Cass would not win. He was associated himself with what at this time became known as the barn burner faction of the New York Democratic Party. So, New York, key state, by far the largest number of electoral votes. New York City by this time is the principal city of the United States, main financial center, transportation hub as well. But as I mentioned, the Democratic Party broke into two competing factions at this time. The so-called hunkers wanted to hunker down with the policies they already had, which meant close alliance with Southern Democrats and a soft on slavery stance. The barn burners, receiving that name from warnings about people who wanted to kill the rats by burning down the barn. Not a very effective strategy, you could say. And you can see in this cartoon from the time, basically making fun of the barn burner faction. But the barn burner faction had really decided that the time had come to really take a moral stance on the expansion of slavery, and they were against it. So with Martin Van Buren coming in, he doesn't take any electoral votes, but he takes 10% of the popular vote. And Zachary Taylor then goes on to victory. And you can see on the map that Zachary Taylor even won New York, Martin Van Buren's home state, partly because Van Buren and the Free Soil Party did quite well in New York, which then meant it turned to the Whigs. So in this election, we could see as far as geographical patterns, the Whigs still did quite well in much of the South, although losing a number of important states there. And the Democrats did quite well in the far west. Every state in the old Northwest went for Lewis Cass. And the Whigs under Zachary Taylor did quite well in the Northeast, although losing Maine and New Hampshire. So this was a close run election. The Democrats actually retook the House of Representatives. They lose a few Senate seats, but they retain control. So Taylor comes in as a Whig president with the Democrats controlling both houses of Congress. Taylor had a short and troubled presidency. He was the first president who never held elective office. He really angered his fellow Southerners. So he's the Southern Whig, plantation owner from Louisiana, cotton Whig, but he turns and backs the admission of California as a free state. So the population of California had exploded with the gold rush. There were both Southerners and Northerners moving into California. California certainly had proponents of slavery, but the majority was opposed to slavery, so California applies for admission as a free state, and Taylor supports this. But it doesn't actually happen under his watch because he died of a stomach ailment after 16 months in office. The usual story was that it was a 4th of July celebration. He ate a prodigious quantity of cherries in raw milk. Got food poisoning, lingered for a while, and died. There were many conspiracy theories at the time, and it persisted for over 100 years that he was actually been poisoned by disgruntled Southerners who were furious that this Southern plantation owner would turn on them and want to admit California as a free state. And in 1991, his body was actually exhumed and tested, and there were no signs of poisoning. It is important to point out that Washington, D.C. at this time was noted for its insalubrious environment. There were many swampy areas. Malaria and yellow fever were not unknown by any means, and the water supply was not good. Not maybe an entirely unusual event here. Zachary Taylor is followed by his vice president, Millard Fillmore, who was the last Whig president. There were two elected, both of whom died quickly soon after taking office. Both were succeeded by vice presidents who were not highly regarded. Millard Fillmore is best known for being an anti-Catholic nativist. Later on, he's going to be highly involved in the Know Nothing or American Party, which was opposed to immigration, especially of Irish and Germans. He's a Northerner. He's from New York and supposedly personally regarded slavery as evil, but thought that the federal government could do nothing about it. And this angered the Northern Whigs, who were increasingly turning against slavery. He did address the slavery controversy through what is known as the Compromise of 1850, but that just didn't solve the issue. He's maybe best known internationally for forcing the opening of Japan to trade by American ships. So one of the important things that's happening at the same time is a huge increase in immigration. So there had been plenty of Irish and Germans who had migrated to the United States in the colonial period, well, before it's the United States, and in the early period of the Republic. By the 1820s and 30s, that migration stream had really dipped down. But then in the 1840s and 1850s and 1860s, it heats up in a huge way. And there are a couple of things really propelling this. As far as the Irish goes, is the potato famine. Ireland was controlled by, well, it's actually part of the United Kingdom at this time, but its Catholic peasants were heavily repressed by their English landlords. Irish were basically living on a diet of potatoes and milk and a few vegetables, cabbage and kale, which actually is an adequate diet, but the potato crop, and during this time, Ireland was exporting huge amounts of wheat and other goods to Britain, but the potato crop was hit by a blight. It was pretty much wiped out, a fungal blight. The Irish began starving to death by the tens, hundreds of thousands. Vast numbers were actually encouraged to leave the land by their landlords and others and migrate to the United States. So there was this huge wave of migration. A lot of Germans were coming at the same time. A lot of this was linked to 1848 when there were revolutions all over continental Europe, but especially in what later became Germany. And all those revolutions were crushed, and many of their leaders and others who were involved with this fled to the United States. So anyway, under Millard Fillmore, this Compromise of 1850 was worked out in Congress, signed by the president, and it allowed California to come in as a free state, which upset a lot of people in the South because it upset the balance between free and slave states. But then in return, something known as the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, and this act claimed that escaped slaves who had made it to the North could be essentially kidnapped and returned to their ex-slavers, and that officials and citizens of free state had to cooperate with them, and there would be large fines and possible jail time for people helping the enslaved escape to the North. This resulted in real furor in the North. You can see this poster from Boston, caution colored people of Boston. You must be watching out for kidnappers and slave catchers who are coming to remove your freedom and take you back into slavery. And this meant that escape from slavery became much more difficult and really propelled the nascent abolition movement in the North. In the 1850 midterm elections, the Whigs lose House seats, but more importantly, new parties are emerging. The Whigs are starting to begin this process of collapse. The divide between the Northern Whigs and the Southern Whigs is becoming too great as the Northern Whigs start turning more and more against the expansion of slavery and even slavery itself. And the Southern Whigs, who are dominated by the elite plantation-owning class, that's the last thing they want. So we can see here the Free Soil Party that had been in there a little bit earlier, which I mentioned before. There's another Southern Union Party. There's a Southern Rights Party. So we're really getting into a period of flux here. And in the 1852 election, the Whigs are really losing position. They pick another general from the Mexican War, Winfield Scott, who actually led that army to Mexico City. And the Democrats pick Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire. Both parties had a real difficult time as division between their northern and southern branches are increasing. That's happening in both parties. So 53 ballots for the Whigs and 48 for the Democrats. Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, who was picked, was part of a group known as the Dough-Faced. It's an insulting term, which meant a northern supporter of slavery. I mean, not just a northerner who's willing to compromise over slavery, but one who really supports it. It's also a timid man, so it's sort of an insult. But you could see on the map here that's an overwhelming victory for Franklin Pierce, 254 electoral votes to 42. Scott wins only in Kentucky and Tennessee, Vermont and Massachusetts, which were especially Kentucky and Massachusetts real strongholds of the Whig Party. And I won't spend too much time on this county level map because the patterns we've all seen before, but what is evident is the loss of Whig support in many areas. They still have their real strongholds. You can see western North Carolina area where a lot of people wanted internal improvements. It's still pretty strong in the biggest plantation belts of the South, strong in the burned over district of western New York, and the still some strength in the Western Reserve area of Ohio, and certainly strong in Vermont, but otherwise not doing well. So one of the reasons why the Whigs were lost a lot of ground in the North was to this new, relatively new anti-slavery, or certainly anti-expansion of slavery, Free Soil Party. And you could just see the geography of the Free Soil vote here. The map, the highest category is only 6%, but their candidate, John Hale, took only 5% nationwide, but he took 22% of the vote in Massachusetts, 20% in Vermont, 14% in the relatively new state of Wisconsin. And you could see that's really a sort of a far northern pattern with a few exceptions. Most of New England, New York except the Hudson River Valley and New York City, but certainly the burned over districts, very strong in that Western Reserve zone of Ohio, but also strong in southern Michigan, where most of the population lived, in northern Illinois. These areas had both been settled very extensively by people from New England and the mid-Atlantic states who were opposed to slavery, so those become real anti-slavery hotbeds, if you will. 1854 sees another congressional act that further inflames the division between slavery's opponents and supporters, and that's called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And essentially what this act did was to repeal the Compromise of 1820. Again, to reiterate, that compromise said Missouri can come in as a slave state, but in areas further west, there is to be no slavery in any places north of the southern boundary of Missouri. 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. But the proponents of popular sovereignty like Stephen Douglas and Lewis Cass were really pushing for a new situation where the settlers, the white settlers in those areas, could decide whether they wanted slavery or not. So popular sovereignty is going to be the issue. This was a contentious debate, to be sure. It's very interesting to look at the map. I actually was able to find a map here of the congressional vote. So the final House vote of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Northern Democrats were pretty split, 44 in favor, 42 against. Northern Whigs entirely opposed to it. Southern Democrats overwhelmingly in support of it, 57-2, and Southern Whigs mostly in support of it, 12-7. And I'm going to read a line from a Wikipedia article which summarizes how this bill fared in the House, or what was entailed. So to quote, a filibuster led by Lewis Campbell, an Ohio free soiler, nearly provoked the House into a war of more than words. Campbell, joined by other anti-slavery Northerners, exchanged insults and invective with Southerners, neither side giving quarter. Weapons were brandished on the floor of the House. Finally, bumptiousness gave way to violence. Henry Edmondson, a Virginia Democrat, well-oiled, in other words, drunk, and well-armed, had to be restrained from making a violent attack on Campbell. Only after the sergeant-at-arms arrested him was the debate cut off. So, if you think politics are contentious in the United States, consider what was happening back in 1854. And as you can well imagine, anti-slavery forces were infuriated by this act. So you could see here forcing slavery down the throat of a free soiler. I put a red box around a couple of terms there on the Democratic platform. So one is Kansas and the other is Cuba. So the Democrats still want Cuba, and they want Kansas, and many of them, the Southern Democrats, as a slave state. So by the original compromise of 1820, Kansas would have had to have been a free state, but that compromise has been undone by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that leads to competitive migration. So you get New Englanders organizing societies to send settlers into Texas, into Kansas, who will make Kansas a free state by virtue of their numbers. But then slave owners, especially from Missouri, want Kansas as a slave state. So they're moving in as well, and they're actually engaged in a low-level war against each other. So this was known as Bleeding Kansas, where you had anti-slavery settlers and pro-slavery settlers fighting it out. The city of Lawrence, which is now where the University of Kansas is, one of Kansas's few blue areas today. There are a few. Lawrence is probably one of the more important ones. But the city of Lawrence, which was settled by free soil people, was sacked by supporters of slavery, was burned down. There were other reprisals after that. So it was a very bloody, Bleeding Kansas. Yeah, it was bloody. No surprise. Under President Pierce, there was some expansionism, one success and one failure. So the success was the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico. So Mexico didn't want to go to war against the United States. The United States offered money. A lot of this was to get a better railroad route to California. So that was done. But the Democrats are really also pushing for the annexation of Cuba. There was a leaked secret document from the Democrats arguing that the U.S. should declare war on Spain if they refused to sell Cuba. And this greatly angered a lot of Northerners who certainly did not want to see a war with Spain, and certainly did not want to see another slave state come in. In 1854, largely because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party just collapses. A party with pro-slavery forces and anti-slavery forces can no longer work together. The Democrats are having their own problems, but they do hold together for the next election. And meanwhile, there's a new party, the Republican Party, emerges. And it's founded mostly by Northern Whigs, but also the Free Soil Party, which had included Martin Van Buren, although he left it at this time. Van Buren goes back to the Democrats at the end, decides that party loyalty is more important than his opposition to slavery. But Free Soil Party members and anti-slavery Northern Democrats. So the illustration here shows the terrible rout and total destruction of the Whig Party. It is over with. Meanwhile, there's competition from a new party, and that is the American Party, or the Know Nothing. So this was secretive. People would ask them about their new party. They would say, I know nothing about it. So it's secretive, but very much nativist, anti-immigration, especially anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-German, and in California, anti-Chinese. The illustration shows two figures absconding with a ballot box, and one is Irish whiskey and the other is lager beer. Lager beer being the drink of German immigrants. German immigrants really established the beer industry in the United States. But you can see the very clear associations and violence at a polling place. The American Party had other platforms that they were actually, by the standards of the time, relatively pro-labor and wanted the more regulation of burgeoning industries. And at least in some states, in the northern states, they also wanted more rights for women, not to the extent of women's suffrage, but at least it was something that some of them were pushing. In researching this lecture, I was really surprised to learn a few things about the Know Nothing or American Party. I mean, I knew about the party, and I had just assumed that a nativist party that's anti-Catholic, anti-Irish, anti-German, and Chinese would be anti-Semitic as well. But most scholars say, no, actually it wasn't anti-Semitic. They actually supported Daniel Ullman, a Jewish candidate who was seeking to become governor of New York. And later he became a Civil War general. There were some 7 Jewish Civil War generals. But in trying to explain why the Know Nothing Party was not particularly anti-Semitic, I'll quote from the Wikipedia again. It says, the Know Nothing Party had nothing to say about Jews, according to historian Hasia Diener, reportedly because its backers believed Jews, unlike Catholics, did not allow their religious feelings to interfere with their political views. And this is this sort of relatively apolitical nature of the Jewish community is something that had been developed long ago in the diaspora to avoid, well, to try to mitigate anti-Semitism and try to establish a tolerated place in different societies, to try to avoid that. And Jews in the South tended to be very much in favor of the Confederacy. Jews in the North very much in favor of the North as well. Obviously, things will change later on, but that was common at the time. So this American or Know Nothing Party came out of nowhere, and largely because of this huge influx of Irish Catholics and Germans into the country, rose to quite a bit of power quite quickly. In 1854, they actually had a trifecta in Massachusetts. They controlled both houses and the governor. A number of other states, including California, the old Whig stronghold of Kentucky, and the old Federalist and Whig stronghold in Delaware. They had control of at least considerable influence or control of one or more houses of the legislature. I read conflicting things and didn't have time to delve too deeply into it, but you see a lot of support in New England and several other areas of the country. And if we look at the House of Representatives election of 1854, the American or Know Nothing Party is in purple, and you could see New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and then a lot of areas scattered across the South as well. And those most of those southern areas did not have, they had some Irish immigration and German, but not nearly as much as other areas. But that nativist sentiment ran pretty strong. You can also see a party here, the Anti-Nebraska Party. The Whigs had collapsed, and there's still some Whig. Actually, the Whigs still had a few gains here, but they've ceased to be a national party. In Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and Michigan, the Whig Party collapsed entirely, and that was where the Republican Party was founded. There are debates of whether it was founded in Ripon, Wisconsin, or Jackson, Michigan, but it was the sort of Northwestern Whigs who formed this new Republican Party, which is going to go on to victory across the North, even in 1856. But you can really see, see the People's Party here in Indiana. So again, really a period in flux. But the Republican Party is the one that's going to go on very quickly to unite the North, or at least the far North. They were not openly abolitionist yet. That was considered too radical, but they were firmly opposed to any expansion of slavery. They wanted Kansas to be admitted as a free state. They also adopted a lot of the old Whig platforms about the American system of Henry Clay, in other words, tariffs and internal improvements. They wanted government federal support for a transcontinental railway, protective tariffs. They also wanted the Homestead Act to encourage the development of free labor, where you can see this book here, The Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, the Ideology of the Republican Party Before the Civil War. So all these things were sort of went together. And they nominated John C. Fremont, who was a noted military leader and explorer of the West. Yeah, he was involved in the war against Mexico, especially in California, became very famous in California. There's a town right across the bay, city right across the bay from where I live in the San Francisco Bay area called City of Fremont. But anyway, you could see in this 1856 election, this is the last election I'm going to cover, you could see that the Democratic candidate James Buchanan got well less than 50% of the vote, with the rest divided between John C. Fremont of the New Republican Party and Millard Fillmore, former vice president and former president, who joined the Know Nothing or American Party, winning 21% of the popular vote. The map on the right has a very clear pattern. It's interesting, the one state that Fillmore was able to win and get its electoral votes was Maryland, which had received a large amount of immigrants coming into the port of Baltimore. Baltimore was one of the main port cities in the country at the time. And then Fremont winning across the far north, New England and New York, and then the more northerly states of the Old Northwest. The Know Nothing Party, though, is at this time collapsing in the far north. Remember from earlier slides, it had been very powerful in New England, but then the American or Know Nothing Party decided to endorse the Kansas-Nebraska Act that anti-slavery forces hated so much. So in this presidential election of 1856, you could see the Know Nothing under Fillmore here. This shows the Fillmore Know Nothing vote. And you can see Fillmore did quite well in a number of areas of the South, but in the North, except New York, but certainly in New England, his support had absolutely collapsed. Just a few more slides here. But this 1856 election won by James Buchanan from Pennsylvania. Supposedly one of James Buchanan's great attributes that led the Democrats to select him is that he had been the U.S. ambassador in Britain during the controversy over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, so he really wasn't part of that very contentious, controversial issue. So he could claim to be untainted by it. But you could see on the map here how well John C. Fremont, the Republican candidate, did. And you can note these old strongholds of anti-slavery sentiments. The Western Reserve of Ohio, you can see very clearly. Most of Western New York, not Buffalo, not the large city. And then relatively newly settled areas in Wisconsin, very heavily settled by Germans and Scandinavians. Northern Illinois, mostly settled by people from New England and the upstate New York. And then a mixture in the South, old Whig areas going for Millard Fillmore, the nativist candidate, the real sort of plantation centers. And if we look at a cartogram, this is one of the first elections in which I've been able to find a cartogram for it, where we have in a cartogram the size and shape of different counties are going to vary in accordance with their population. And I put this in mostly to show you the importance of New York City, how large it is on the map, and how it was not overwhelmingly, but definitely supported the Democratic candidate, as it is going to continue to do for most elections for a long period of time. We had a very large number of immigrants, particularly Irish immigrants, in New York who tended to support the Democratic Party, which was more favorably disposed to immigrants. Well, certainly than the Know Nothing Party, but even more so than the Republican Party. And if we look at the Republican support, the support for John C. Fremont at the time, again, you could just see this very clear northern pattern, interrupted in New York by the Hudson Valley, which tended to be, and that was the old area of the Albany Regency of Martin Van Buren and the Democratic Party, so that is not a strongly Republican zone. But western New York, northern Ohio, and on across into the new states of Wisconsin and Iowa. This is a lead up then to the election of 1860, which will be covered in a separate lecture. I'll talk about the period between 1856 and 1860. And it's that election of 1860 when Republican Abraham Lincoln wins that results in the secession of the South and the Civil War. So I will talk about that in the next lecture. So just to recapitulate some of the main themes here in this lecture, we saw the solidification of the Whig Party. We saw the Whigs emulating the Democrats in campaigning at a mass level, with campaigns turning into popular events and celebrations, but then the Whigs failing to develop the kind of, didn't really discuss this, but they never really developed the depth of party organization that the Democrats had done under Van Buren and Jackson. But the big problem with the Whigs was the division between their northern and southern branches, with their southern branches being the most pro-slavery element in the country, and their northern branch being the most anti-slavery element. That was not sustainable, and so the Whigs break down, and the whole slavery controversy just intensifying up to the breaking point. So I'll talk about that in the next lecture. Thank you for listening to this lecture, and I hope you tune in for later ones.